Sri Gurubhyo Namaha, and welcome to the Sri Vidya Temple's online chanting classes. We're currently focusing on Rudram, Namakam, and Chamakam in preparation for an Atirudram that is happening at the temple in July. So for today's session, what I would like to do is go over how Rudram Namakam is chanted for Homa. So I'm sure you all know that when you do an event like Maharudram or Atirudram, there's a certain number of chants that must be completed. And then 10% of those chants will be offered as Homa. And when you're doing the Homa, the most critical thing is actually the offerings, the ahutis that are offered with each swaha. So that's where it's helpful for people who are serving as ritiks and making the offerings to have a little bit of a preparation and sense of where the swahas are going to come. So that's what I'd like to do today. So one important thing to note is that there's more than one way to do Rudra Homa. So there's two primary ways that I'm most familiar with because that's what I've seen at most large events. One is the sort of 169 ahutis version, which is where the word swaha comes in 169 specific locations of Namakam. And that's something that we would typically do at the temple during Shivaratri or something like that. Then there's another version with 48 swahas. So this is a little bit simpler and it goes a little bit faster. So during the Atirudram, we're most likely to do the version with 48 swahas. But I want to just sort of point out how the two different versions function so that people are clear. Okay, so I think what I'll do is I will share my screen and I'll show the English version for our practice. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see the Rudra Homa Vidhi on my screen.
Yes,
Okay, great. All right. So the version that I'm showing on the screen is the 169 Ahutis version, but there are similarities. So basically, if you'll notice in the first Anuvakam, so I'm going to go through the whole thing and sort of explain it, and then I'll go back to the beginning and actually chant the lines like a practice, like we've done before. So in the first Anuvakam, the swahas come almost every other line because these are actually individual mantras that have been combined to make the first Anuvakam. So the swahas come at the end of each mantra. So here you can see swaha, 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 and so on. Then there's one place where it actually comes after 3 lines because that particular mantra has 3 lines in it. So this is this one that starts Asau Yo Vasarpati, and then the 2 Utainam lines. So the swaha comes at the 3rd one. So it's good just to be aware that it's not always the same pattern. So you definitely want to listen for the swahas if you happen to be making offerings, because it is important to make the offering during a homam when you actually say swaha and not at a different random time. So I just want to point out this one case where the swaha is in every other line. Okay. Now, what we're going to be practicing is the lines with swahas, because as you'll see when we get into it, the swara will change and pronunciation will change slightly if a word ended in anuswara. So we'll see some examples of that. Okay, so first Anuvakam goes on. This part where we say Namaste Astu Bhagavan Vishweshwaraya, that does not get a swaha. I'm not sure if that comes from Vedas or where it might come from. but it does not get a swaha. Okay, so starting with the second anuvakam, that's where the difference happens. So in the 169 version, this entire anuvakam, which normally we would just chant like in one flow, gets broken up into separate lines, and each line gets a swaha. So this would have been pataye namo, namo vrikshebhyo, but because there's now a swaha here, this becomes namas swaha. And that pretty much continues. It's kind of like a pattern that goes all the way through second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. And then in the eighth, I just want to point out one thing which people often trip over or get confused by. You can see that most of the lines, it's like two names and then a swaha, two names and then a swaha. But here in Namastaraya, there's only the one name and then swaha, Namastaraya swaha. So that's kind of breaking the pattern, and people sometimes get tripped up over that. So I just wanted to point out that one. That's the only sort of one that sticks out like that. And then when we get to the end of the 9th anuvakam, this part is also slightly tricky. So if you're used to the way we chant Rudram in the temple currently, then you'll be used to seeing this Devanagam Hridayebhyo or Hridayebhyaha phrase being repeated after each of these names or words. Whereas in the typical style of chanting Rudram, this Devanagam Hridayebhyaha does not get repeated. So, but for Homam, in the 169 version, it does get repeated, and the swaha is added at the end. Now, if we're doing the 48 version, which is this, the slower one, or sorry, the shorter one, this Devanagam Hridayebhyaha will not be repeated. You would just chant the 9th anuvakam in the regular way. And then it would be Namaami Vatkebhya Swaha. So one thing I think I forgot to mention is that in the 48 version, anuvakas 2 through 9, you just chant the anuvakam in the regular way and add the swaha at the end. So that's why it's considered fairly simple. Okay, it's only in the 169 version that these anuvakas 2 through 9 are split up with many swahas at the end of each line. Okay. And then when we come to the 10th anuvakam, this is where you'll return to this sort of every other line pattern. And then when we come to the 11th anuvakam, you might recognize this from how we often chant Rudram in the temple, but this line, Teshagam Sahasrayojane, gets repeated after the first time that it occurs, and the swaha comes at the end of this line. Whereas this Teshagam line doesn't always get repeated when you're just chanting in a regular style. And then the final difference between like the regular chanting of Rudram and the Homa style is that this Namo Rudrebhyo line, which often is just one line, gets split up into 3. So there's 3 swahas at the end of each line. So that's like the final difference between Homa version and the way that we would be normally chanting it. At the end of Rudram comes the Mrityunjaya mantra, and so sometimes, generally, I believe a swaha will be added at the end of that. It's a little bit of an extra one. And then for the rest of the mantras, if they're chanted, there won't be any swaha starting from Yorudro. Okay. So hopefully I explained that okay. Does anyone have any questions on like the difference between 48 and 169 or anything that I've already said?
I think I have a little bit confused with the 169 and 48. And are you going to chant first the shorter version, much easier to understand,
Yes,
and then go
yes.
back to one? Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not planning to practice any of these lines from Anuvakas 2 through 9, which is showing the 169 version. Because for the most part, they follow, because it'll take a long time. And also because for the most part, they follow the same pattern. So once you get the hang of it, it's pretty simple. I'm going to be focusing more on the 48 version and just focusing on the first, 10th, and 11th Anuvakas because those are common to both forms.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Namaste, Ekama. This is
Namaste.
Sirisha. In the 11th Anuvakam, I have the confusion at the end that the same, the ADV part repeats, right, multiple times, but there is a subtle difference that the last one, subtle difference that I don't understand. What's the difference
Okay,
in each
that's
of these lines?
that's a really good question. Okay, so in the normal way of chanting Rudram, like the basic style that it comes in the Vedas, this Namo Rudrebhyo line is just one line. And so what you can see is Ye Prithivyam, and then in the second version, Yen Tarikshe, Ye Antarikshe. And then in the third one, Ye Devi, that will all be combined, like Ye Prithivyang, Yen Tarikshe, Ye Devi. Then you can see Ye Shamanam, and in the second line, Ye Sham Vata, or wind, and then Ye Sham Varsham. Those three will also get combined in order. So this is talking about Prithvi, the earth, Antariksham, the sort of middle part, and then Devi, which is the heavens, the divine portions. And then it's talking about Annam, or food, Vata, or wind. These are just literal meanings, and then Varsha, or rain. So food goes with earth, wind goes with the antariksham, and rain, or varsham, goes with Divi, the divine portions. So when it's combined, it'll be like Namo Rudrebhyo ye Prithivyang ye Antarikshe ye Divi ye Shamannam Vato Varshamishavaste Dashap, and then it goes on. So the three couples will be combined into one series, whereas when it's broken into three separate lines, those three couples or pairs of things, it's just one pair per line. So here we have Prithvi Annam, Antariksham Vata, Divi Varsham. Okay, does that make it any more clear?
Yes, Amma. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. So this part is definitely tricky. In the temple, we often chant it in this style where the three are separated out. So that means we would be more prepared for when the Homa comes. Whereas people who are used to chanting this all at one will often get very much tripped up over the different way that it occurs.
Yeah.
So it just depends on, what you're more used to. But this is one tricky part for sure. So this deserves some extra practice for anyone who wants to do, Rudrahoma on their own, or, who may be chanting during the event. And just to let people know, when you're at an event like Maharudram or Atirudram, during the Homa, the most critical thing is the offerings that are made and making them at the swahas. So if a Ritvik or somebody is actually sitting at a Homa Kundam and actually making offerings, the focus is on the offerings, not necessarily the chanting. The chanting will be taken care of, by whoever is the lead chanters or chanting on the microphone or something. But for those actually offering, the most important thing is to make the offering at the swaha. So if anyone is not really familiar with this, they don't need to chant, and it may be better not to chant at that time because you want to focus on listening for the swahas and then offering. So that's just one small thing I wanted to mention. But I think it is helpful to sort of understand the basic idea of where the swahas are coming in. It just makes it a little bit easier to either chant it or to listen for it if you're actually making offerings. Okay, so if there are no other questions, then we can start with the line practice and sort of explaining how the lines change in subtle ways when it's followed by a swaha. So let me just talk about that for 1 second. So the things that will change are the swaras. Typically the swara will be down. So if you look at this one, normally this would be Bahubhya mutate namaha, but here it becomes te namaswaha. So that's a very common change, that the swara of the final syllable will become a down swara, a lower swara. The other main change that happens is when a line ends in makara. If I can just find one little example. Yeah, so this one, it ends in tam. So normally this would be tam, but because of a word following it, that ma sound becomes anuswara, which then undergoes changes. And so the main change is that tam becomes taggu. So it's that peculiar gu version of anuswara that we find in Krishna Yajurveda. Okay, so those are the two main things. All right, so let me start my Shruti. Okay, so first I'm going to do 3 times of this line. Namaste astu. Namaste astu dhanvane bahubhyamutate namasvaha. Namaste astu dhanvane bahubhyamutate namasvaha. Namaste astu dhanvane bahubhyamutate namasvaha. Okay, so that's the first one. Next, we have starting with Shiva Sharavya. Shiva Sharavya Yatavataya no Rudram Hridaya Swaha. Shiva Sharavya Yatavataya no Rudram Hridaya Swaha. Shiva Sharavya Yatavataya no Rudram Hridaya Swaha. Okay, next, Taya Nastanuva. Tayanastanuva Shantamaya Girishantabhijakashihi Swaha. Tayanastanuva Shantamaya Girishantabhijakashihi Swaha. Tayanastanuva Shantamaya Girishantabhijakashihi Swaha. Next, Shivangiritratam. Shivangiritratam Gurumahi Gumsif Purushan Jagat Swaha. Shivangiritratam Gurumahi Gumsif Purushan Jagat Swaha. Shivangiritratam Gurumahi Gumsif Purushan Jagat Swaha. Next, Yathanas Sarvamit. Yathanas sarvamit jagada yakshmagum sumana asat swaha. Yathanas sarvamit jagada yakshmagum sumana asat swaha. Yathanas sarvamit jagada yakshmagum sumana asat swaha. Next, ahigascha. Ahigascha sarvaan jambhayanth sarva aschayatu dhanya swaha. Ahigascha sarvaan jambhayanth sarva aschayatu dhanya swaha. Ahigascha sarvaan jambhayan sarva ascha yatu dhanya svaha. Next, ye che magam. Ye che magam rudra abhido dikshusrita sahasrasho vaishagam heda imahe svaha. Ye che magam rudra abhido dikshusrita sahasrasho vaishagam heda imahe svaha. Ye che magam rudra abhido dikshusrita sahasrasho vaishagam heda imahe svaha. Next, Utainam Vishva. Utainam Vishva Bhutani Sadrushto Mridayate Nasvaha. Utainam Vishva Bhutani Sadrushto Mridayate Nasvaha. Utainam Vishva Bhutani Sadrushto Mridayate Nasvaha. Okay, next, Athoye. Athoye asya sattva no hante bhyo karannama svaha. Athoye asya sattva no hante bhyo karannama svaha. Athoye asya sattva no hante bhyo karannama svaha. Next, Yaschate. Yaschate hasta ishavah parata bhagavo vapasvaha. Yaschate hasta ishavah parata bhagavo vapasvaha. Yaschate hasta ishavah parata bhagavo vapasvaha. Next, Nishirya Shalyanam. Nishirya Shalyanam Mukha Shivona Sumana Bhavasvaha. Nishirya Shalyanam Mukha Shivona Sumana Bhavasvaha. Nishirya Shalyanam Mukha Shivona Sumana Bhavasvaha. Next, Aneshan Nasyeshava. Aneshan Nasyeshava Abhurasya Nishangathe Svaha. Aneshan Nasyeshava Abhurasya Nishangathe Svaha. Aneshan Nasyeshava Abhurasya Nishangathe Svaha. Next, Tayasman. Tayasman Vishvatastama Yakshmaya Paribhuja Svaha. Tayasman Vishvatastama Yakshmaya Paribhuja Svaha. Tayasman Vishvatastama Yakshmaya Paribhuja Svaha. Next, Ubhabhyam. Ubhabhyamutate namo bahubhyam tavadhanvane svaha. Ubhabhyamutate namo bahubhyam tavadhanvane svaha. Ubhabhyamutate namo bahubhyam tavadhanvane svaha. And next, Athoya. Athoya ishudhistavare asmannidhehi takkasvaha. Athoya ishudhistavare asmannidhehi takkasvaha. Athoya ishudhistavare asmannidhehi takkasvaha. Okay, any questions on any of the swaha lines from the first Anuvakam?
Oh, Ekta, the last one, can you do that after Nama? How does it changing before Swaha? Atoya Yushodhistavare Asmanide Hit.
So in this line, there's no namaha.
Oh, because in my book it is there. Okay. Okay, tag. Okay. Tag.
So in this line,
Tam becomes tag, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I'm looking at the Sanskrit one, what we have, the Agni Mukham. It is in that one. Okay, thank you. I just saw your English note. Thank you.
Yeah, I think when that Agni Mukham was done back in
Yeah.
2010,
Yeah,
there were some small corrections that they
Yeah.
needed to make. And so
Yeah.
in some copies, I think
Yeah.
those might
Okay.
not have made it.
yeah. I will
Um,
just look up yours
so
and do it.
in Rudram, this line ends in tam.
Okay,
So
yeah.
because tam is followed by swaha, it becomes taggu.
Okay, yeah,
Tag-
I just saw it. Yeah, okay. I was
No problem.
following with my, thank you.
No problem. Okay, so I'll just do this line one more time. Athoya ishudhistavare asmannidhehi taggu swaha. Okay, so hopefully that's all clear. So I'm not going to go through the second Anuvakam. If we're doing it as the 48 Swahakaras, second Anuvakam would just be recited as usual, except for the very end. So this would become Sattanam Pataye Namah Swaha. So that's an example of an Anuvakam like that. So that's how the ones 2 through 9 would be chanted. Okay, so I'm just going to skip over that. So skip over everything from 2 through 9. Except I'm just going to do these final ones from the 9th Anuvakam, because they are slightly different. And one other small mistake that people often make is they say Hridaye Bhyo Swaha. Because they're used to saying Hridaye Bhyo Namo, Hridaye Bhyo Namo, and so on. This word is actually Hridaye Bhyaha. So in front of the na in Namo, we pronounce it as Hridaye Bhyo Namo, but the original word is Hridaye Bhyaha. So in front of Swaha, it's pronounced as Hridaye Bhyaswaha. So we don't want to pronounce that as Hridaye Bhyo Swaha. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. So now I'll just practice these final lines. Namo Vahkirikebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Namo Vahkirikebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Namo Vahkirikebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Now the next one. Namo Vikshinakebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Namo Vikshinakebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Namo Vikshinakebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Next one. Namo Vijinvatkebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Namo Vijinvatkebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Namo Vijinvatkebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Next one. Nama Anirhatebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Nama Anirhatebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. Nama Anirhatebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. And the last one. Namami Vatkebhyo Devanagam Hridayebhya Swaha. So, sorry, that's actually how that would be done in 169. So even I get a little bit confused. For the 48 version, it would be Namami Vatkebhya Swaha. Okay, so sorry if I confuse the issue. Okay, going on to the 10th Anuvakam. These again are the shorter lines, so it's like a series of mantras similar to the first Anuvakam. So Swaha comes approximately every other line here. So now we'll practice the Esham Purushanam line. Esham Purushanam Esham Pashunam Mabher Maromo Esham Kinchanama Matsvaha Esham Purushanam Esham Pashunam Mabher Maromo Esham Kinchanama Matsvaha Esham Purushanam Esham Pashunam Mabher Maromo Esham Kinchanama Matsvaha. Now Shiva Rudrasya. Shiva Rudrasya Bheshajidayano Mridajivase Svaha. Shiva Rudrasya Bheshajidayano Mridajivase Svaha. Shiva Rudrasya Bheshajidayano Mridajivase Svaha. Next line is Yathanas. Make this a little bit smaller. Okay. Yathanas Shamasadvipade Chatushpade Vishwam Pushtangrame Asmin Naturakusvaha. Yathanas Shamasadvipade Chatushpade Vishwam Pushtangrame Asmin Naturakusvaha. Yathanas Shamasadvipade Chatushpade Vishwam Pushtangrame Asmin Naturakusvaha. So here again, notice how this line would normally end in naturam, asmin naturam. So the becomes a g in front of the swaha. Okay, next the yachancha. Yachancha yoshtamanuraya jepita tadashyama tavarudra pranito swaha. Yachancha yoshtamanuraya jepita tadashyama tavarudra pranito swaha. Yachancha yoshtamanuraya jepita tadashyama tavarudra pranito swaha. Next, Manovadhi. Manovadhi pitaram mota mataram priyamanastanugo rudraririsha swaha. Manovadhi pitaram mota mataram priyamanastanugo rudraririsha swaha. Manovadhi pitaram mota mataram priyamanastanugo rudraririsha swaha. Next, Viranma. Viranmano rudrabhamito vadhiraha vishmanto namasa vidhemate swaha. Viranmano rudrabhamito vadhiraha vishmanto namasa vidhemate swaha. Viranmano rudrabhamito vadhiraha vishmanto namasa vidhemate swaha. Next, Rakshachano. Rakshachano adhijadeva bruhyatha chana sharma yachatvivarha swaha. Rakshachano adhijadeva bruhyatha chana sharma yachatvivarha swaha. Rakshachano adhijadeva bruhyatha chana sharma yachatvivarha swaha. And this is one of the more confusing lines. People often trip up over this because normally this would be a dirgha swarita at the end, but it has changed to the lower swara. So people often, it's dvibaraha aha. That's how it would normally be in regular chanting. But again, it's dvibaraha swaha. So that's one tricky part. Next, we have Mruda Jaritre. Mruda Jaritre Rudrastavano Anyante Asmanniva Pantu Sena Swaha. मृडाजरित्रे रुद्रस्तवानो अन्यन्ते अस्मन्निव पन्तु सेना स्वाहा मृडाजरित्रे रुद्रस्तवानो अन्यन्ते अस्मन्निव पन्तु सेना स्वाहा Next, avasthira. Avasthira maghavadyastanoshvamidhvastokayatanayaya mridaya svaha. Avasthira maghavadyastanoshvamidhvastokayatanayaya mridaya svaha. Avasthira maghavadyastanoshvamidhvastokayatanayaya mridaya svaha. Next, parame. Parame vriksha ayudhan nidhaya krityam vasana acharapinakam bibhradaga svaha. Parame vriksha ayudhan nidhaya krityam vasana acharapinakam bibhradaga svaha. Parame vriksha ayudhan nidhaya krityam vasana acharapinakam bibhradaga svaha. Next, yaste. Yaste sahasragam hetayonyamasmanniva pantuta svaha. Yaste sahasragam hetayonyamasmanniva pantuta svaha. Yaste sahasragam hetayonyamasmanniva pantuta svaha. Okay, next we have Tasamishano. Tasamishano bhagavah parajina mukha krudhi svaha. Tasamishano bhagavah parajina mukha krudhi svaha. Tasamishano bhagavah parajina mukha krudhi svaha. Okay, any questions from the 10th Anuvakam? Okay, all clear. So with the final Anuvakam, number 11, this is where the line Teshagam repeats several times. So I'm just going to practice it by repeating it 3 times, and then we'll skip over the rest. Teshagam sahasrayojane vadhanvani tanmasi svaha. Teshagam sahasrayojane vadhanvani tanmasi svaha. Teshagam sahasrayojane vadhanvani tanmasi svaha. Okay, so then it repeats a number of times until the final Namo Rudrebhyo comes. So now I'm going to practice those. So the first one. Namo Rudrebhyo ye prithivyang ye shamannamishavastebhyo dasha prachir dasa dakshina dasha pratichir dashotichir dasordhastebhyo namaste no mridayantu te yandvishmo yaschanod dveshtitam vojam bhedadhami svaha. And now a little bit faster. Namo Rudrebhyo ye prithivyang ye shamannamishavastebhyo dasha prachir dasa dakshina dasha pratichir dasodichir dashordhastebhyo namaste no mridayantu te yandvishmo yaschano tveshtitam vojam bhedadhami svaha. Namo Rudrebhyo ye prithivyang ye shamannamishavastebhyo dasha prachir dasha dakshina dasha pratichir dasodichir dasordhastebhyo namaste no mridayantu te yan vishmo yaschano tveshtitam vojam bhedadhami svaha. Now the second one. Namo Rudrebhyo ye entarikshe ye shamvata ishavastebhyo dasha prachir dasa dakshina dasha pratichir दशोदीचेर्दशोर्ध्वास्तेभ्यो नमस्ते नो मृडयन्तु ते यन्द्विष्मो यश्च नो द्वेष्टितं वोजम्भे दधामि स्वाहा नमो रुद्रेभ्यो ये एन्तरिक्षे येषां वात इषवस्तेभ्यो दश प्राचीर्दश दक्षिणा दश प्रतीचीर्दशोदीचीर्दशोर्ध्वास्तेभ्यो नमस्ते नो मृडयन्तु ते यन्द्विष्मो यश्च नो द्वेषितं वोजम्भे दधामि स्वाहा. Now the final one. नमो रुद्रेभ्यो ये दिवि येषां वर्षमिषवस्तेभ्यो दश प्राचीर्दश दक्षिणा दश प्रतीचीर्दशोदीचीर्दशोर्ध्वास्तेभ्यो नमस्ते नो मृडयन्तु ते यन्द्विष्मो यश्च नो द्वेष्टितं वोजम्भे दधामि स्वाहा. नमो रुद्रेभ्यो ये दिवि येषां वर्षमिषवस्तेभ्यो दश प्राचीर्दश दक्षिणा दश प्रतीचीर्दशोदीचीर्दशोर्ध्वास्तेभ्यो नमस्ते नो मृडयन्तु ते यन्द्विष्मो यश्च नो द्वेषितं वोजम्भे दधामि स्वाहा. नमो रुद्रेभ्यो ये दिवि येषां वर्षमिषवस्तेभ्यो दश प्राचीर्दश दक्षिणा दश प्रतीचीर्दशोदीचीर्दशोर्ध्वास्तेभ्यो नमस्ते नो मृडयन्तु ते यन्द्विष्मो यश्च नो द्वेषितं वोजम्भे दधामि स्वाहा. And finally, I'll just demonstrate how this Urvarukamiva line is chanted for Homa, because normally it ends in the Dirgha Swarita, Mamrutaat, but this changes with a Swaha. So I'll just chant that. Urvarukamiva bandhanan mrityormukshiyamamrutat Swaha. Urvarukamiva bandhanan mrityormukshiyamamrutat swaha. Urvarukamiva bandhanan mrityormukshiyamamrutat swaha. Okay, so that completes the 11th Anuvakam. Any questions on that? Okay. So any questions on anything that I explained, anything that I didn't explain clearly?
Hi, Amma.
Hello.
Amma, I don't get it. You chant Namo Rudrapyo few times, right? What's the difference between those? I don't get it. Sorry.
That's okay. Okay. So in the final line, there are three, so there's parts that get repeated, which is basically like Namo Rudrebhyo. So I offer my namaskaras to the Rudras, the Rudra deities that are in all the directions. So there are three things that are mentioned. Prithvi, along with Annam, and then also Antariksham, along with Vata, and then Devi, along with Varsham. So Prithvi is the earth, Antariksham is like the sky, Devi is like the heavens, the divine regions. Along with Prithvi or earth, we have Annam, which is rice or food. Along with Antariksham, we have Vatam, which is wind. And along with Devi, the divine regions, we have Varsha, or the rains. So when you're chanting in the normal version, these three couples or three pairs of items are all listed together in one long string. So it goes something like, Namo Rudrebhyo ye Prithivyan ye Antarikshe ye Divi ye Shamanno Vato Varashamishavastebhyo, like that. All the six individual things are just listed in one long line. When we split that whole thing into three separate lines, those three pairs or three couples are put in their own line. So here in the first one, we have Prithvi with Annam, then Antariksham with Vata, then Divi with Varsham. Okay, does that make it any more clear?
Yes, Amma. Thank
Okay,
you.
good. It's a confusing part. It's a very long line. It's hard to chant. So definitely this, is helped a lot with a lot of extra repetition and practice, for sure, because this is definitely a very tricky part. But
Thank
again,
you.
typically it's only broken up into 3 parts for the Homam. And so most commonly, when it's chanted for Abhishekam or regular Parayanam, it'll just be the one line. And that's how we did it in the practice sessions earlier on.
Thank you,
Okay,
Amma.
sure. Any other questions?
Amma, I joined a little late. I didn't understand the numbers that you were talking about, 49, 160 something.
Sure, no problem. So what I was explaining is that when doing Rudra Homa, there are 2 sort of major versions that I'm most familiar with and that I've ever heard at major events. So in one version, we refer to that as the version with 169 ahutis or 169 swahas, because with each swaha, you're making the offering. So that means that in that version, the swaha or the ahuti offering comes 169 times in specific places in the namakam. There is also a slightly simpler version, which takes a little less time. And that's known as the one with 48 swahas or 48 ahutis. And so there's a difference in the placement, but both the versions are essentially the same for the 1st, the 10th, and the 11th anuvakas. The change only comes in the middle part with those long anuvakas. Does that make it clear about the difference between the 48 and the 169?
So for the 48 one, all the other Anuvakams from 2 to 8, they are all just does one swaha?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, 2 through 9, it'll just be one swaha per
One.
anuvakam
Per
at the end.
Anuvakam. Okay. Otherwise, we do individual line, except for one place you pointed out in the 8th Anuvakam where we have.
If it's 169, then each of those anuvakas from the 2nd through the 9th gets split up into separate lines. So just to show you
right. You were mentioning
the
okay.
example, like here, like normally this would be Namasomaya cha rudraya cha namastamraya cha runaya cha namash, right? So, but instead we insert these swahas sort of every 2 names approximately, except for this one place that I mentioned. Okay, but that's the 169 version, which is longer. I personally really enjoy that version, but usually when there's a major event, often the Homa is done on the final day, and there's a lot that has to happen on that final day. So as a result, we need to keep up the pace and save a little bit of time. So very often we may do the version with 48 swahas during big events.
So is that what we are going to be doing at Ati Rudramama, or?
There's a good chance that that's what will happen just because of the time constraints. I don't know for certain, but there's a good chance that's what it will be. So it's good to be familiar with both versions and sort of understand the differences between them. Because as I said earlier, like during Shivaratri at the temple, we tend to do the longer 169 version. So it's good to be familiar with both, like just in case, because you never know.
Thank you, Ma.
Sure.
Amma, one more request, Amma. The Shanti Padam, I do chant. Sometimes I do make mistake. Will you do it for us, please?
So you mean the Shanchame, Mayashchame, Priyanchame?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
sure.
you.
So that's the 3rd Anuvakam from Chamakam, which gets used as the sort of Shanti prayer for Namakam. So normally if we're chanting Namakam and we're not going to chant the entire Chamakam, just that 3rd one will be chanted, the one Shanchame Mayashchame. So we are going to do some kind of class or practice session for Chamakam. So we will go over that in more detail, but since we have time now, I can do that one. I'll just do it once through.
Thank you, Emma.
Sure. If I can find it. Okay. Shanja me mayascha me priyancha me nukamascha me kamascha me somanasascha me bhadrancha me shreyascha me vasyascha me yashascha me bhagascha me travinancha me yantacha me dhartacha me क्षेमश्च मे धृतिश्च मे विश्वञ्च मे महश्च मे संविच्च मे ज्ञात्रञ्च मे सुश्च मे प्रसूश्च मे सीरञ्च मे लयश्च मरुतञ्च मे मृतञ्च मे यक्ष्मञ्च मे नामयच्च मे जीवातुश्च मे दीर्घायुत्वञ्च मे नमित्रञ्च मे भयञ्च मे सुगञ्च मे शयनञ्च मे सुषा च मे सुदिनञ्च मे. So all of the anuvakas in Chamakam are definitely a little bit tricky because this chame comes so much, and there will be slight variations in the swaras. So sometimes the me is down, sometimes it's flat. So it's definitely one of the more tricky ones. So we can go over that in sort of a Chamakam class. And I'm trying to determine whether we should do that more like we did the Namakam practice sessions, where I'm just repeating the parts 3 times, or if we should do it more like a class where the students are repeating the lines and getting corrected as we go. So that's something that people can think about, which one they might prefer. And then I'll talk more to Nandini Amma, and we'll see what seems to be the better option. Okay, so are there any other questions? Just want to make sure. Okay, all right, so there seems like there's no more questions. So I'll end the class here. So Sri Gurubhyo Namaha, thanks very much for joining. And we'll see you next time for Chamakam.